Alexander Hale smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored Armani jacket, the material a subtle emblem of a career marked by unchallenged dominance. In the austere confines of this legal chamber, his marital split was supposed to mark the ultimate conquest in reshaping his existence. He anticipated sobs, a shattered partner, the lingering specter of the spouse he had abandoned. But then Victoria entered, not fractured, but tempered like steel. The understated, refined gown she chose didn't suggest surrender. It resonated with a subdued authority he hadn't witnessed in ages. Her gaze, sharp and unwavering, locked onto his. In that one disquieting moment, Alexander grasped that this wasn't a conclusion. It was a confrontation. The atmosphere in Hearing Room 3C of the Cook County Courthouse hung heavy with the aroma of aged documents and chilled ventilation, a clinical fragrance for the silent demise of unions. Alexander Hale remained untouched by it. To him, this resembled yet another executive suite, another deal where his stance was impregnable. He positioned himself at the gleaming oak desk, an emperor in his made-to-measure Brioni attire, supported by Victor Lang, an attorney famed for his ferocity as much as his exorbitant fees. Next to him, Olivia, his betrothed, clasped his fingers. Her grip was impeccably groomed and detached, her sapphire engagement band snaring the overhead glow in a barrage of assertive glints. She embodied tomorrow. Youthful, lively, a stunning emblem of his achievements. He had rehearsed this occasion mentally for seasons. It was the concluding administrative hurdle in sealing an era he had already revised. He envisioned Victoria showing up disheveled, her locks marginally disarrayed, her lids swollen from an evening of weeping. He conjured the figure he had deserted, a companion who had morphed, in his thoughts, into a worn snapshot from an existence he had surpassed. He had rehearsed a facade of aloof compassion, a pose he had drilled before the expansive mirror in his fresh high-rise overlooking the bustling grid of Chicago. Yet the individual who swung open the substantial chamber portals was no snapshot. She was an enigma. Victoria advanced with a tranquil, nearly eerie poise. The charcoal gray sheath she sported was unpretentious yet flawlessly fitted. Her raven tresses gathered in a sleek, graceful twist. There were no traces of restless evenings. The subtle creases near her eyes hinted at insight, not grief. She wasn't relying on her counsel for aid. She strode alongside him as a peer. Her survey of the space was brief, detached, probing, before settling on Alexander. It wasn't a stare of animosity or devastation. It was an evaluation, as though she was perceiving him distinctly after a considerable interval, and maybe not wholly admiring. The aloof compassion he had readied evaporated unspoken. In its stead, an icy twist of unease coiled in his gut. This was not the quivering, vanquished figure his storyline demanded. Everyone stand. The bailiff's command thundered, and the rasping shift of seats pierced the hush. Judge Harlan, a jurist known for tolerating no nonsense, assumed her position, her scrutiny, keen and perceptive, sweeping over the litigants. We convene today to conclude the termination of the union between Alexander Hale and Victoria Hale. Mr. Lang, I have examined the suggested agreement. It seems ample. Victor Lang ascended, his grin as refined and lustrous as his footwear. Absolutely, Your Honor. Mr. Hale aims to guarantee Ms. Hale is adequately provided for, honoring their 22 years of wedlock. He delivered it with an aura of immense benevolence, as if Alexander were bestowing upon her a modest nation. Alexander observed Victoria for any response, a spark of appreciation, ease. He detected none. She perched with impeccable, immobile bearing, her palms settled serenely on her thighs. Her advocate, a gentleman called Marcus Reed, whose practice was esteemed but scarcely rivaling Lang's caliber, rose. Your Honor, Reed commenced, his tone composed and firm. My client, Ms. Hale, values the completeness of Mr. Hale's proposal. A brief interlude. Alexander sensed Olivia stir at his side, her talons pressing faintly into his palm. Nevertheless, Reed pressed on, we are not assembled here to deliberate the allocation of joint properties in the conventional manner. My client does not challenge the provision for the residence, the spousal maintenance, or the provisions for their offspring, Amelia. Lang's conceited demeanor wavered momentarily. This deviated from the anticipated sequence. Alexander inclined nearer, the twist in his belly constricting. What was this? Employ for greater sums. Then what exactly are we assembled to address, Mr. Reed? Judge Harlan inquired, her forehead creasing. Marcus Reed unfurled a leather-clad dossier on the surface. We gather, Your Honor, to submit a petition acknowledging Victoria Hale, not as a reliant partner, but as a primary collaborator in Hale Dynamics. A profound hush enveloped the hearing room. Alexander felt the color ebb from his visage. He fixed on Victoria, who at last pivoted her head and engaged his stare squarely. The subdued authority he had noted previously now bore a label. Resolve. Olivia exhaled sharply beside him, a minuscule affronted noise. That is absurd, Your Honor, Lang stammered, regaining his composure. Hale Dynamics was established by Mr. Hale independently. Miss Hale served as a domestic guardian, an exemplary parent, undoubtedly, but she bore no role in the enterprise. Is that accurate, Mr. Hale? Judge Harlan's attention now pinned him, piercing like a fragment of ice. Alexander parted his lips, yet no utterance emerged. His thoughts whirled, hurled backward 24 years to a confined shed reeking of lubricant and aspiration. He envisioned Victoria, then merely 24, scrutinizing his disordered blueprints, her liberal arts background lending her a flair for aesthetics he lacked. He recalled her auctioning her deceased parents' vintage sedan to fund their initial patent submission. He recalled her juggling dual employments to sustain them while he pursued a vision, her faith in him the sole genuine investment he possessed. He had overlooked, or more precisely, he had elected to overlook. He had interred those recollections beneath strata of triumph, recasting the chronicle until he stood as the exclusive lead, the autonomous prodigy. Victoria's counsel glided a file across the expanse. We possess her parents' monetary draft for the patent. We hold her conceptual drawings for the initial trio of item models. And we have over a dozen verified declarations from initial staff who will attest that Victoria Hale was not merely an encouraging spouse. She was the designer of the firm's comprehensive user experience doctrine. Each phrase landed like a sledgehammer strike, eroding the veneer of his existence. He glanced at Olivia, her countenance a veneer of bewilderment and rage, her sapphire band abruptly appearing garish and tawdry. He glanced at Victoria, her demeanor not exultant but steadfast. She wasn't present to demolish him. She was present for authenticity. And amid the oppressive quiet of that hearing room, Alexander Hale, the individual who possessed all, comprehended he had forfeited the sole element that had ever genuinely counted. The journey back to the Sterling estate was a muted, oppressive venture. Olivia, unusually, was mute, her cognition evidently whirring to assess the monetary ramifications of Victoria's revelation. The astonishment had soured into a toxic ire that emanated from her impulses. Alexander gazed through the shaded pane of the Mercedes, the oak-lined avenues of Chicago smudging into an apathetic verdant haze. The dwelling, upon arrival, seemed less a sanctuary and more a mausoleum. It was a tribute to his prosperity. A vast edifice of transparency, alloy, and ivory stone that Olivia had precisely orchestrated with a designer who discoursed more on void areas than coziness. Every plane gleamed to reflective perfection. Every furnishing piece, a sparse artistic endeavor that intimidated actual occupancy. There were no smudges on the panes, no disarray on the ledges, no vitality. I can't fathom her audacity. Olivia ultimately erupted, hurling her outrageously costly handbag onto an ivory pedestal. The clamor reverberated in the expansive entryway. A co-collaborator after everything you've bestowed upon her. She's avaricious, resentful. Alexander, Victor will demolish this. This is an outrage. Alexander proceeded beyond her, his strides jarringly resonant on the stone flooring. He approached the expanse-spanning pane that surveyed an endless basin which in turn surveyed the metropolis. It was the panorama he had perpetually craved, the evidence he reigned supreme. Today it merely appeared isolated. She auctioned her parents' sedan, he murmured, his tone subdued, remote. What? Olivia retorted sharply, trailing him. What do you mean? A 1968 Camaro. It was the sole heirloom he bequeathed her, he persisted, addressing the pain more than her. She cherished that vehicle, but our patent due date loomed and we lacked $2,000, so she parted with it. Without a second thought. Olivia regarded him, her flawlessly contoured features blending impatience and incredulity. Alexander, that was 2 decades past. This is present. Are you truly waxing nostalgic? She aims to pilfer millions from us. The term us lingered, sounding vacant and commercial. He pivoted to face her. He beheld the attractive, driven female he had selected, the one who graced his elbow at soirees, who comprehended the value of influence and facade. But for the initial instance, he sought in her visage and absence, a communal chronicle. She was a lovely enhancement to his days, but Victoria had formed the bedrock. He was abruptly, fiercely propelled into a reminiscence so intense it resembled temporal displacement. They occupied the galley of their inaugural abode, a compact leased cottage in Wicker Park that perpetually carried a trace of lilac from the untamed shrubbery exterior. He was 32 and Hale Dynamics had secured its premier substantial pact. He was alarmed, elated, and profoundly fatigued. Ethan, their boy, was a young child, clanging a timber utensil against a vessel on the ground. And Amelia was a fresh, cozy burden in Victoria's embrace. Victoria was agitating a cauldron of pasta gravy, her mane in a disordered coil, a streak of starch on her jawline. She donned an aged, pigment-bespattered pullover of his. She glanced upward and ensnared his regard, a gradual, luminous grin unfurling over her lips. She required no verbalization. In that grin, he discerned it entirely. I trust you. We shall manage. We navigate this jointly. Subsequently that evening, with the offspring slumbering, they lounged on their uneven thrift store settee, partaking a bargain vintage of Merlot. He divulged his terrors, that he was a pretender, that he would falter and haul them all downward. Victoria clasped his palm, her contact heated and reliable. Alexander, she had uttered, her inflection brimming with a vehement, subdued assurance. Setback is merely an observation. We'll derive lessons from it, but you shan't falter because your foresight is exceptional and you're not solitary. The reminiscence dissolved, bequeathing a deep pang in its wake. He surveyed the clinical, soundless estate. He and Olivia lacked dialogues of that nature. They conferred on investment holdings, travel locales, and which philanthropic gathering yielded optimal connections. They never broached dread or setback because in their realm such notions were forbidden. Alexander, are you attending to me? Olivia's timbre cut through his contemplation, edged with vexation. Victor is phoning. We require a plan. He regarded the endless basin, its plain impeccably tranquil, mirroring the frigid, vacant firmament. He had erected this existence, this flawless burnished enclosure, fragment by fragment. He had bartered the tumultuous warmth of that Wicker Park cottage for this soundless citadel. He had bartered a comrade for an ornament. He believed he had advanced, that he had discarded his prior days like a serpent discards its integument. But positioned there with the resonance of his antiquity echoing in his ears, he sensed a frightful, nauseating epiphany emerge. He hadn't discarded his prior integument. He had discarded his essence, and he hadn't observed its departure until precisely now. He had triumphed in all he ever desired, and now he was insolvent in manners his auditor could never quantify. While Alexander wandered his ornate enclosure, Victoria tended her azaleas. Her fresh abode was a humble 2-level bungalow in a serene Lincoln Park district, the sort with a broad veranda and a faintly groaning mesh portal. It was a realm distant from the Sterling estate, and she had never sensed greater serenity. The structure wasn't adorned with artworks selected for fiscal yield. It brimmed with the untidy, dynamic creations of her progeny, displayed and elevated with esteem. The atmosphere carried scents of garden earth, citrus wood treatment, and the oatmeal raisins Amelia was preparing in the scullery. Following her departure from Alexander, or rather after he had declared his exit from her, there had been a span of descent. The jolt, the treachery, the utter communal mortification of it had struck like a corporeal assault. For fortnights, she had operated on instinct. Her cosmos contracted to the pressing requisites of her offspring, Ethan and Amelia. Her companions had united, anticipating her collapse. They delivered baked dishes and spirits and referenced Alexander in subdued, incensed whispers. They urged her to engage the fiercest counsel available to extract every cent from him. But as the primal astonishment ebbed, an alternative arose. It wasn't a yearning for reprisal. It was a gradual, emerging perception of lucidity. For annals, she had dwelled in Alexander's eclipse, her individuality absorbed by her functions as consort of, nurturer of. The estate had commenced to resemble a confinement well before Olivia's emergence, a locale where her own fervor, her creativity, her affinity for layout were deemed charming minor diversions. She had regarded her progeny at Ethan's seething resentment and Amelia's subdued, perplexed anguish, and comprehended that indulging in martyrdom was an extravagance she couldn't indulge. Beyond that, it wasn't her nature. The identical female who had auctioned her parents' sedan and drafted emblems on café serviettes lingered within, concealed beneath eras of household routine. She merely needed to rediscover her. Thus, she relocated from the estate, declining Alexander's suggestion to install her in a barren opulent flat. Instead, she located this dwelling, a site demanding labor, a site she could infuse with her own vigor. She initiated a compact horticultural layout venture, directing her aesthetic vision into crafting lovely, peaceful enclosures for individuals. It commenced with an acquaintance's rear yard, then an adjacent resident, and shortly via referrals, she maintained a queue. It wasn't a multimillion endeavor, but it belonged to her. She was erecting something anew with her own efforts. "Mother, the pastries are prepared," Amelia summoned from the scullery. Victoria grinned, placing the irrigation vessel. "They aroma divine, darling." She proceeded inward, the galley warmth enfolding her. Amelia, at 16, inherited her father's acute acumen, but her mother's empathetic spirit. The split had afflicted her severely. But witnessing her mother reclaim her own fortitude had served as a potent stabilizer. Ethan phoned, Amelia mentioned, transferring a flawlessly golden pastry to a chilling frame. He inquired regarding today's proceedings. Ethan, her lad, was 19, a second year at Northwestern and vehemently safeguarding. He had discerned the reality of his parents' liaison well before Victoria had permitted herself to, and his ire toward Alexander was a crude, exposed lesion. "It was intriguing," Victoria replied, selecting her phrasing judiciously. "Did father appear astonished?" Amelia queried, her inflection tinged with a trace of gratification. Victoria reflected on Alexander's countenance, the preliminary haughtiness liquefying into dazed incredulity. "Indeed," she affirmed. "I believe he was." She hadn't resolved to submit for her primary collaboration cavalierly. It wasn't regarding the funds, though she recognized the worth of her due. It concerned reclaiming her own chronicle. For 2 decades, Alexander had narrated the tale of Hale dynamics, and with each iteration, her function had lessened until it evaporated utterly. He wasn't solely excising her from his tomorrow. He was excising her from their mutual antiquity. Her progeny, she discerned, were maturing amid a legend, a narrative wherein their father was an isolated savant and their mother a marginal note. She couldn't permit that to persist. Not for herself and not for them. "Your grandsire would be gratified, you realize," Victoria murmured gently, regarding Amelia. He perpetually stated, "The paramount possession you can claim is your personal narrative." Subsequently that dusk, after Amelia had ascended for studies, Victoria reclined on her veranda rocker, a mug of mint infusion in her grasp. The lane was still, the breeze redolent with evening flowering lilac, the identical fragrance as their premier modest abode. She hadn't contemplated that in Eros. Her device vibrated. It was a dispatch from Marcus Reed. "Lang contacted. He's issuing threats of a rebuttal action for spiteful purpose." It perturbed Victoria marginally. Remain resolute. A 12-month prior, a communiqué like that would have plunged her into alarm. This evening, she merely sensed a serene determination. She wasn't the alarmed, reliant female they presumed. She was the female who had aided erect an dominion from a shed. She had confronted insolvency, weariness, and insurmountable barriers. A combative attorney in a $1,000 garment scarcely appeared daunting comparatively. She pondered Alexander, not with ire, but with a deep and fatigued melancholy. He had acquired the cosmos, but had misplaced his bearing. He was adrift in an ocean of his own devising, encircled by lustrous, vacant objects. She wasn't contending against him for vengeance. In an odd manner, she was contending for him as well. She was contending for authenticity because solely by facing the veritable narrative of his ascent would he ever possess an opportunity to rediscover the individual he formerly embodied. The individual who had been her ally in every connotation. The petition Victoria submitted dispatched a seismic tremor through Alexander's meticulously assembled realm. The account was divulged to the commercial media. Not the chaotic particulars of the liaison, but the infinitely more captivating saga of the astute former spouse asserting her portion in a tech dominion. The banners were merciless. The specter in the apparatus. Did Alexander Hale obliterate his co-establisher? Abruptly, Alexander wasn't merely a separating executive. He was a prospective deceiver. The Council of Hale Dynamics, a cadre of resolute gray-haired gentlemen who prized steadiness paramount, were summoning urgent assemblies. His share valuation experienced a minor yet evident decline. The strain within the sterling estate grew intolerable. Olivia's primal rage had transformed into a frenzied, compulsive crusade to orchestrate the visuals of the circumstance. She was perpetually on the line with publicity specialists and jurists. Her timbre a crisp, directive rhythm that resounded through the stone corridors. "We must issue a declaration," she proclaimed one twilight, striding before the chill, unignited hearth. She was attired in cream satin loungers that likely exceeded Victoria's quarterly dwelling payment. Something portraying her as a malcontent consort retaliating. "We'll emphasize your charitable endeavors, your dedication to the firm. We must dominate the chronicle, Alexander." Alexander occupied a hide wingback, a tumbler of undrunk Glenfiddich 25 in his grasp. He was fixating on an antiquated snapshot he had exhumed from a repository crate, a bleached instant of him and Victoria, youthful and radiant, positioned before their shed atelier. A placard they had inscribed manually was affixed to the entry. Hail Dynamics Central. There exists no chronicle, Olivia, he uttered, his timbre weary. There's merely authenticity. Authenticity is what multitudes accept, she countered, her aggravation surging. And currently, they're commencing to accept hers. This impacts the enterprise. This impacts my tomorrow, our tomorrow. There it surfaced anew, the bare, unadorned self-regard. He regarded her, truly regarded her, and discerned the crude alarm in her gaze. She wasn't alarmed for him or for the soundness of his lifetime labor. She was alarmed because the ornate enclosure she had labored diligently to infiltrate was imperiled. The opulence, the prestige, the assurance. It all hinged on a figure in a fiscal vault. A figure Victoria was now endangering to substantially diminish. When we initially encountered, Alexander articulated deliberately, the reminiscence emerging with agonizing precision. You informed me you were struck by my ambition, my foresight. I remain so, she affirmed, her pitch mellowing as she essayed an alternate approach. She approached and knelt beside his seat, resting a palm on his shin. You're the most ingenious male I've encountered. No, he refuted, oscillating his skull. You were struck by my aircraft. You were struck by my loft in Boston. You were struck by the reality I could reserve a starred eatery for an exclusive repast. You enamored with the outcomes, Olivia. You never harbored curiosity for the procedure. She withdrew as if he had struck her. That's unjust. I cherish you. The phrases resounded vacant, practiced. Did she? Or did she cherish the notion of him, the authority he exercised? He recollected the arduous nascent eras with Victoria, the century-hour labor spans, the instant noodle suppers, the perpetual gnawing apprehension of collapse. Victoria had been in the furrows with him. She had lauded every minuscule conquest and softened every devastating reversal. Olivia had materialized for the triumph procession, flute aloft. The rupture arrived several days subsequently. Alexander was on a virtual assembly with the council. A savage episode wherein he was compelled to vindicate his individual soundness. He was depleted and dispirited. Post-termination, he entered their principal chamber to discover Olivia amid fabric samples and layout periodicals. I'm contemplating refurbishing the Lake Geneva retreat, she declared vivaciously, as if he hadn't just undergone vocational dissection. This styling is so obsolete. I desire something more contemporary. Straight edges. What of this Swiss granite? She elevated a periodical, indicating a lavatory resembling an operating theater. Alexander stared at her. The utter, consummate disconnection from his actuality was staggering. He was battling for the essence of his enterprise, for his repute, and she fretted over internal aesthetics. A somber, acrid chuckle escaped his throat. What's amusing? She queried, her forehead furrowing. The Lake Geneva retreat, he articulated, the terms oozing with an sarcasm she couldn't conceivably grasp. Victoria detested that retreat. She deemed it pretentious. She deemed we procured it to impress individuals we scarcely favored. Well, she erred, Olivia affirmed guardedly. It's a declarative asset. No, Olivia, he uttered, the depletion in his timbre supplanted by an abrupt, frosty lucidity. She was correct. He advanced to the wardrobe, an immense ambulatory chamber vaster than his premier flat. He extracted a valise. What are you undertaking? Olivia inquired, her timbre ascending in distress. I'm heading to an inn, he affirmed, hurling blouses and slacks into the pouch with systematic accuracy. I require solitude. I require reflection. Reflect on what? How to combat her? No, Alexander affirmed, halting to regard her, the instant from the shed flickering in his cognition. I require reflection on how to convey authenticity. Alarm inundated Olivia's visage. This was an element she hadn't factored. And Alexander uninterested in combat, in prevailing regardless of expense. You can't be earnest. You'll demolish all. For what? Some errant remorse over a female you abandoned? I didn't solely abandon her, Olivia, he articulated, his timbre perilously subdued. I endeavored to efface her, and I'm merely now commencing to comprehend the distinction. He fastened the valise and departed the chamber, abandoning her solitary amid her samples and periodicals, the mute sovereign of an vacant, disintegrating realm. The clinical hush of the in-chamber offered a grateful intermission. For the premier instance in eras, Alexander was encircled by an void of anticipation. There were no council affiliates to placate, no societal timetables to oversee, no Olivia attempting to restyle their existence. There lingered solely him and the oppressive burden of his own selections. It was amid this isolation that he discerned the strife with Victoria over the firm was a manifestation of a far profounder affliction. The veritable tolls of his crusade against antiquity were his progeny. He hadn't encountered much of Ethan and Amelia since the parting. He informed himself it was due to their immersion in personal pursuits, academia, secondary acquaintances. But the verity was he had preserved separation because their proximity was a reflector displaying a rendition of himself he shunned. A shortfall as a progenitor. His endeavors at linkage were awkward and mercantile. He'd dispatch currency, procure them lavish presents they hadn't solicited, and propose excursions to elite diners where the quiet amid them was as dense and ponderous as the plush drapes. He resolved to attempt anew, not with a grandiose display, but with an elementary act. He telephoned Amelia. "Hello, dear, it's father." The intermission on the line was indicative. "Greetings," I pondered. "Would you and Ethan be available for some flatbread this weekend? That antique venue we frequented in Elmwood." Gino's. Another intermission. Gino's had been their haunt. It was inexpensive, boisterous, and featured oily crimson plaid cloths. It was where they ventured for anniversaries and post-athletic matches. It was a locale from the antecedent. "I'll need to consult Ethan," Amelia articulated, her timbre non-committal. "I'll dispatch a note." She did dispatch hours later. Ethan affirms Saturday at 7. The dearth of zeal was tangible, but it was an affirmative. When he entered Gino's that Saturday, they were already positioned in an alcove rearward. Beholding them united was a surge. Ethan, with his ebony, fervent gaze, so akin to Victoria's, had a safeguarding limb draped over the alcove rear behind his sibling. Amelia was tugging at a frayed filament on her denim, her posture stooped. They resembled two warriors in adversarial ground. "Greetings," Alexander articulated, gliding into the alcove. The synthetic was fissured and recognizable. "Appreciate attending." Amelia desired to, Ethan articulated, his timbre level. It was an prompt elucidation. "I'm solely here for her." The gulf amid them sensed vast, insurmountable. He essayed to occupy it with trivial discourse. He queried Ethan regarding his courses, Amelia about her impending creative endeavor. Their retorts were succinct, curt. The ether was dense with unvoiced indictments. The jubilant clamor of the flatbreadery, clans chuckling, mandates bellowed, merely accentuated their own taut quiet. Their flatbread materialized, a grand salami variant precisely as they perpetually commissioned. Alexander apportioned them each a segment, an unadorned familial deed that sensed alien and staged. It was Amelia who ultimately fractured the strain. "Mother mentioned you vacated the dwelling." "Indeed," Alexander affirmed, thankful for the aperture. I'm at an inn temporarily. Merely required hush. Hush from what? Ethan interrogated, his gaze constricting. Your betrothed irking you? Is it laborious overseeing the existence you demolished ours for? Ethan, Amelia murmured, resting a palm on his limb. No, it's a valid inquiry, Alexander affirmed, regarding his lad. He discerned not solely ire, but deep, profound injury. I wrought havoc. I recognize that. Havoc? Ethan's chuckle was grating. Havoc is when you overturn something. You ignited an explosive in our clan's midst and departed with your fresh companion while mothers sifted the debris. You term that havoc? Every term rang true. Hearing it from his lad was like ingesting shards. What you're enacting to mother presently with the firm, Ethan persisted, his timbre quivering with curbed wrath. She conveyed us the verity regarding all. How she aided you initiate it. You didn't solely depart her. You endeavored to pilfer her entire lifetime narrative. Do you possess any notion what that's akin to? To observe your mother contend for acknowledgement of her own existence against the male who was presumed her ally? Alexander harbored no justification. There existed naught he could articulate that wouldn't resonate as a vacant pretext. He merely sat and endured it. Your mother, he articulated, his timbre raspy, is the most astute, enduring individual I've encountered. And I presumed that. I overlooked who we were. I commenced crediting my own publicity. I am so remorseful for the entirety. It sufficed not. A remorse couldn't mend the lesions he had imposed, but it was the premier candid utterance he had directed to his progeny in eras. Amelia had been taciturn, her gaze brimming with moisture. I long for you, she whispered so faintly he scarcely perceived it. I long for who you formerly were. That was the assault that ultimately pulverized him. It wasn't Ethan's ire, but Amelia's subdued sorrow. It was the comprehension that his progeny weren't solely irate at his deeds. They were lamenting the progenitor he had embodied. A progenitor who attended their athletic contests, who assisted their assignments, who subsisted in their existences as a heated, steadfast presence, not an affluent, remote patron. He regarded his two progeny, these remarkable beings he and Victoria had nurtured, and discerned the complete ruinous scope of his selections. The currency, the estate, the acclaim of the commercial sphere, it was all cinders. He had been so fixated on erecting a heritage of triumph that he had utterly eradicated his own clan. His depiction in their existences was diminishing, and he was the one wielding the eraser. The day they reconvened in the hearing, the milieu was wholly altered. The saga had acquired vitality, and the chamber brimmed with a subdued hum of expectancy. Alexander arrived solitary. He had formally dissolved his betrothal with Olivia, an unsightly mercantile exchange involving jurists and confidentiality pacts. It sensed less a dissolution and more a belligerent consolidation collapsing. He sensed no melancholy, solely a somber relief, as if a malady had subsided. He perched at his surface with Victor Lang adjacent. Lang was rigid, his customary sleek assurance supplanted by a fragile guardedness. He had counseled Alexander to contest Victoria's assertion to the ultimate, to inundate her in filings and exhaust her reserves. Alexander had declined. We shall not rebuttal Sue, Alexander had informed him that dawn. We shall not endeavor to undermine her. We shall attend. Lang had regarded him as if he had deranged. When Victoria entered with Marcus Reed, she appeared identically, composed, steadfast. But this instance, when her gaze encountered Alexander's, he didn't divert. He sustained her scrutiny and offered a minor, nearly undetectable inclination. It was a sign of yielding, of esteem. He discerned a glimmer of astonishment in her gaze before she redirected to the jurist. Mr. Lang, Judge Harlan initiated her pitch all commerce. Prior occasion we assembled, Mr. Reed advanced a quite exceptional assertion for his client. Do you possess a retort? Lang ascended, rustling his folios. Your Honor, with appropriate deference, the assertion is unfounded. While Mr. Hale concedes his former spouse's aid in the nascent eras, as any consort would aid another, this in no manner forms a lawful collaboration. He intoned onward, referencing juridical forerunners and firm statutes. Alexander scarcely heeded. He was observing Victoria. He was recollecting. He envisioned her at their galley surface at 2 a.m. revising his enterprise blueprint because, as she mildly phrased, his excelled on the apparatus, but was somewhat hazy on the populace. He envisioned her captivating their premier dubious backer, not with figures, but with a fervent, articulate exposition of how their item would authentically enhance existences. He was the technician. She was the ethic. He had assembled the mechanism, but she had sketched the itinerary. Mr. Reed, the jurist urged when Lang ultimately concluded. Marcus Reed ascended. Your Honor, we could expend fortnights deposing nascent personnel. We could summon analytical auditors and conceptual asset authorities. We could render this into a protracted, unsightly, and profoundly communal conflict. He interposed, permitting the terms to suspend. Alexander discerned Lang's rigidity bracing for the onslaught. But my client harbors no yearning for that, Reed persisted. This was never regarding instigating a conflict. It concerned rectifying the ledger. Thus, we'd favor to suggest an alternate settlement form. He positioned a solitary slender dossier on the surface. A bailiff conveyed it to Judge Harlan and another to Lang. Alexander inclined to peruse Lang's duplicate. It wasn't a requisition for currency. It wasn't an assertion for a fraction of the firm. It was a lone double-interlined leaf. At the summit, in prominent lettering, it proclaimed the formal chronicle of Hale Dynamics, the establishment era. Beneath lay a narration, a saga. It delineated the firm's genesis, not as the legend of the solitary masculine prodigy, but as the verity, a collaboration. It recounted the shed, of Victoria's bequest, of her layout inputs, of her function in molding the firm's principle. It didn't belittle Alexander's function as the technical seer, but it exalted hers to its rightful station as co-establisher, tactician, and ethical guide. The concluding clause was the settlement suggestion. It declared that Victoria would relinquish all assertions to establishment portions and any fiscal involvement beyond the standard joint property allocation. In exchange, the script, this veritable chronicle, was to be inscribed into the formal firm ledger of Hale Dynamics. It was to be encased and suspended in the entry of the firm central, and it was to be the premier leaf of the Regarding Us division on the firm's network in perpetuity. She wasn't soliciting his currency. She was soliciting authenticity. The quiet in the hearing room was utter. Victor Lang stared at the leaf, wholly perplexed. This was a maneuver so beyond the juridical manual, he harbored no retort. You couldn't combat a saga with a litigation. Judge Harlan completed perusing, removed her spectacles, and regarded from the leaf to Victoria and then to Alexander. A gradual, perceptive expression of deep esteem emerged on her visage. Mr. Hale, she interrogated, her timbre gentler than antecedent. What is your retort to this suggestion? This was the juncture, the apex of all. He could persist in combat. He could regress to the individual he had become, the one who prevailed regardless of expense. He could preserve his fortune and his vanity, or he could preserve himself. Alexander ascended deliberately. He didn't regard his counsel. He regarded Victoria squarely. Your Honor, he articulated, his timbre lucid and firm, unearthing a vigor he hadn't realized lingered. I have perused Miss Hale's script, and I deem it utterly precise. A communal inhalation traversed the chamber. Her inputs were not merely aiding, they were bedrock. Absent her, there would exist no Hale dynamics. I embrace her suggestion wholly, and I would desire to declare for this tribunal and for the ledger that I am profoundly remorseful for my endeavors to excise her from a chronicle that is equally hers as mine. He regarded Victoria. For the premier instance, her serene poise fractured. A solitary droplet traced a trajectory down her jaw. It was not a droplet of melancholy or conquest. It was a droplet of liberation. Authenticity, after innumerable eras, had ultimately been voiced. The prompt sequel was a haze. The Juris Mallet strike was a commencement firearm for a whirlwind of activity. Counselors clustered. Chroniclers hastened, but Alexander perceived none. He sensed an peculiar buoyancy, as if a colossal, unseen burden he had borne for eras had just ascended. He had openly capitulated, relinquished the legend he had meticulously assembled, and in so doing he had reclaimed a fragment of himself he presumed vanished eternally. Victor Lang was incensed. "Alexander, what have you enacted?" he murmured as they bundled their dossiers. "You just tendered her a communal relations explosive. You've conceded on the ledger that the formal saga of your firm was a falsehood." "No, Victor," Alexander articulated serenely, engaging his counsel's wrathful scrutiny. "I just conceded authenticity. There's a variance." He inscribed the ultimate of the filings his counsel proffered, his palm steady. He sensed no contrition. He beheld Victoria and Marcus Reed across the expanse, quietly conferring with the tribunal scribe. He knew he needed to converse with her, not to bargain or elucidate, but merely to conclude. He advanced, his strides resonating his pounding core. Reed observed him approaching, and with an inclination to Victoria, tactfully withdrew. They positioned confronting one another in the now vacating hearing room. The quiet amid them was no longer laden with strain, but replete with the burden of 24 eras of mutual chronicle. The beneficial, the adverse, the splendid, and the fractured. "Appreciate you, Alexander," Victoria articulated, her timbre subdued. It wasn't the triumphant appreciation of a conqueror, but an unadorned, sincere recognition. "Don't appreciate me," he articulated, his timbre dense with sentiment. "You shouldn't have needed to enact any of this. It was your saga throughout. I'm merely remorseful it required me this duration to recollect how to interpret it." He probed her visage, seeking the ire and bitterness he merited to behold there, but it had dissipated. In its stead lay a deep, fatigued melancholy and an alternative. A glimmer of the prior empathy, the sympathy he had misconstrued as frailty for so long. But, he interrogated, the query fleeing him prior to restraint. "Why enact it thus, Victoria? You could have extracted me for millions. You could have incapacitated the firm." She averted for an instant toward the grand casements surveying the metropolis. "What would that have yielded? Our progeny would observe their father devastated and their mother transform into a resentful, affluent female. The firm we erected jointly would be blemished. It would have all been futile. I didn't yearn to annihilate our antiquity, Alexander. I yearned to reclaim it." She pivoted rearward to him, her gaze lucid and forthright. "This was never regarding currency. It concerned our progeny. I desired Ethan and Amelia to comprehend that the female who nurtured them was not merely someone's consort. I desired them to comprehend that their mother aided erect something consequential. I desired them to comprehend that a collaboration, a veritable one, concerns more than what's inscribed on a fiscal document." Her terms struck him with the potency of a corporeal assault. In all his computations, all his egotistic rationalizations, he had never once contemplated that viewpoint. He had been so engrossed with what he was acquiring, while she had been contending for what their progeny were forfeiting. A chronicle to esteem. A crude, jagged wail erupted from his thorax. It was a timbre of pure, unmitigated sorrow for his union, for his clan, for the individual he had failed to embody. The refined veneer of Alexander Hale, executive, pulverized utterly, abandoning solely a fractured, penitent male. He didn't endeavor to conceal it. He permitted her to behold the full profundity of his confrontation. Victoria didn't hasten to solace him. She didn't tender banalities. She merely positioned there and attested to his anguish, bestowing him the decorum of his own dissolution. She had beheld him at his finest and his vilest, and she was beholding him now at his most bared and candid. After a prolonged instant, he ultimately managed to compose himself. He dabbed his gaze, sensing utterly unveiled. "I'm vending the estate," he articulated, the terms cascading. "And Olivia, we're concluded. It's terminated." He wasn't articulating it to reclaim her. He knew that was unattainable. He was articulating it because he required her to comprehend that the delusion was terminated. He was concluded with the existence he'd erected on a groundwork of falsehoods. Victoria merely inclined, accepting the datum sans verdict. "What will you enact now?" "I harbor no notion," he conceded, and it was the most candid retort he'd tendered in a decade. "Attempt to be a progenitor. Attempt to be a superior individual." It resonated hopelessly trite, but in the quiet of that hearing room, it sensed like a hallowed pledge. He knew he couldn't merit her absolution. Not authentically. That wasn't his to solicit. But perhaps, merely perhaps, he could commence the protracted, grueling procedure of meriting his own self-esteem. 3 fortnights subsequently, the cosmos appeared altered. Faithful to his pledge, Alexander had enacted Victoria's suggestion. The freshly dubbed establishment saga was the premier element visitors beheld on the Hale Dynamics network. A exquisitely encased duplicate inscribed on preservation parchment suspended in the entry adjacent the firm's directive declaration. It provoked a commotion in the sector, but a favorable one. The saga of conciliation and soundness was infinitely more potent than the saga of a chaotic split. The firm's shares, post the primal oscillation, had ascended to unprecedented heights. Alexander vended the Sterling estate and relocated to an unassuming, cozy flat in Lakeview, mere blocks from the lakeshore. He vended the aircraft and the Mercedes. He commenced spearheading the firm's charitable arm, a facet of the enterprise he'd perpetually consigned, and unearthed an unanticipated sense of intent in it. He was laboring to erect something not quantified in yield thresholds. The most arduous labor, though, was reconstructing the remnants of his clan. It was a gradual, meticulous procedure with no assurance of triumph. He didn't essay to procure his progeny's fondness anymore. Instead, he materialized. He attended Amelia's creative exhibitions and Ethan's collegiate disputations. He didn't occupy the forefront row. He positioned quietly rearward, anticipating naught. He dispatched them dispatches, not to orchestrate gatherings, but to affirm he esteemed them. The premier advancement materialized unexpectedly. Ethan had a major fiscal exposition, and his device malfunctioned the eve prior. After exhausting all, in an instant of despair, he telephoned Alexander. Alexander abandoned all and expended the ensuing 6 hours with his lad, not as an executive assigning an issue, but as a progenitor, patiently aiding him reclaim the archives and reconstruct the exposition. They toiled until Aurora, propelled by brew and a communal sense of intent. As the dawn ascended, Ethan regarded him across the galley surface, depletion and gratefulness in his gaze. "Appreciate, father," he articulated. The duo terms formed a span across a vast ravine. His association with Victoria unearthed a fresh, subdued cadence. They weren't comrades, not in the conventional connotation. The cicatrices were too profound for that. but they were allies in a novel pursuit, co-nurturing their progeny into maturity. They conversed weekly regarding Amelia's academia submissions or Ethan's midsummer placement schemes. The exchanges were courteous, occasionally somewhat ceremonial, but underpinned by a novel-earned esteem. One Saturday midday, Alexander was at a communal greensward observing Amelia engage in a weekend athletic association. From across the turf, he beheld Victoria on the margins acclaiming. He had resolved to preserve separation at these occasions, granting her latitude. But today she advanced to him. "She's advanced remarkably in her flank strikes," Victoria articulated, her gaze on their offspring. "She possesses your tenacity," Alexander retorted, a minor grin grazing his lips. They positioned in cozy quiet for an instant. Two nurturers observing their child, a communal antiquity and a discreet tomorrow merging in the present juncture. "Ethan informed me you aided him with his endeavor," Victoria articulated, pivoting to regard him. "That was a beneficial deed you enacted, Alexander." "It was the minimal I could enact," he affirmed. "No," she articulated, her scrutiny steady. "It wasn't. It was a commencement." A horn resounded and the match concluded. Amelia's association had prevailed. She hastened over, perspiring and radiant, and embraced her mother. Then she pivoted and sans hesitation tendered Alexander an embrace, too. It was the premier instance she had initiated corporeal fondness since the parting. He clasped his offspring, inundated and ensnared Victoria's scrutiny over Amelia's form. She offered him a minor, nearly undetectable inclination. It wasn't a pledge of absolution, and it certainly wasn't an intimation of reunion. It was in recognition, a realization that he was manifest, that he was endeavoring, that the premier stone of a novel groundwork had been positioned. He knew he would never reclaim what he had so heedlessly discarded. The clan he'd possessed was a realm to which he could never revert. But as he positioned there, amid the female he had maltreated and the offspring he was endeavoring to reclaim, he sensed a glimmer of something he hadn't sensed in eras. Aspiration. The route to reclamation was protracted and indeterminate, but for the premier instance, he was ultimately striding in the correct trajectory. This saga serves as a potent admonition that veritable affluence isn't quantified by share valuations or expanse measurements, but by the soundness of our associations and the authenticity of our personal sagas. Alexander's odyssey from haughty Tycoon to penitent progenitor demonstrates that it's never belated to assume responsibility and initiate the arduous labor of reconstructing. Victoria's subdued fortitude instructs us that authority doesn't invariably bellow. Occasionally it's unearthed in the valor to demand authenticity. What did you conceive of Victoria's ultimate verdict in the hearing? Do you deem Alexander's reclamation veritable? Convey your reflections in the annotations beneath. If this saga stirred you, kindly bestow a thumbs upward, disseminate it with an individual who might require to perceive it, and enlist for additional sentimental, authentic-to-existence sagas.